This is Charlestown.
It's a very nice walk. Even if you only walk from the car park, it's a nice walk. So I've got a pale sky. You can walk from the car park or from the top of the village, go around the harbour, come back again. It's got a very good feel-good factor. So I'm putting in a pale sky, which I'm making with French ultramarine and cobalt turquoise, but very watered down, but it will be warm. And I want it to be warm because I've got cream buildings. I'm not laying it everywhere, I'm leaving some gaps. Go around the hillside because I want those to show up. And then down to the horizon. And I'm just going to drop in some more of the paint because I've still got some at the top. Let it find its own way. And I'm going to use sap green warmed up with a little yellow ochre. And just gently cover the top of the rock. And then I'm going to drop in some other colours. But I want to get the shape of the rock first. And the grass comes quite a long way down the back. And while I'm there, I can do the cliff slightly nearer. It's got some on as well. That's slightly darker. So I'm now changing to, that was a number 4 brush, changing to a number 1 brush. Going to pick up some more yellow ochre and just drop it in a little bit stronger because I want it to show against the grey rock. And the grass nearer the cliff, nearer the building, is darker, so I'm just adding some blue and some sap green. Sap green's a very good standby. Because the building's cream, I want the cliff to stand out from it. And if the cliff's dark, the building will bounce forward. So adding some Payne's grey to that. Just dropping it in from the top. And the grass on the cliff has got 2 directions. So I'm adding yellow ochre from the bottom and then pulling the dark down to the edge. And it comes down to a bit of a point. So I'll return to the sap green for the point. And a little bit of lemon yellow just to give it a bit of punch at the bottom. And it doesn't go all the way because there's a cliff path up there. Now I'm going to mix a homemade grey out of French ultramarine, yellow ochre and Azilian crimson for the rocks. You stir it all up and then you just have to add one of more colour, you know, add a bit more blue or a bit more yellow to get the grey that you want for that job. And then puddle it down and that will cover the rock surface. So I'll cover the white paper, then shortly when it's had a chance to dry for a moment, I can add some browns. And the same here. There is a cliff path, but it's out of sight from this angle, but it does affect the way I'm drawing it. And then another little rock. I'm just going to touch the join, make it more of an invisible mend. Now while they're drying, it's very low tide, I can go to the headland at the back, and because it's very low tide, even it's quite a distance away, you can still see the rocks. So I'm starting on this occasion from the waterline. Then I'm going to mix more yellow ochre and blue with the green I've already got. Because it's further away, it's more distant, and just drop it in. A bit more yellow ochre. Just put in broken colour. It's not the same colour all over. I'm deliberately leaving gaps and then putting in a different colour to make it look more like a random headland. A little bit of dark, and then the dark goes all the way round, and then drop in some light underneath. Probably will need a second coat, but I've made a good start. And then the headland behind it is slightly brown on top, so mixing some burnt sienna with the dark green, just dropping that in, and on the tip there's an area of brown. Now I'm just going back with a clean brush and just bringing it forward so the line's not so harsh, and then whilst it's wet, dropping in some green and a little bit of yellow ochre. Now the area behind the building is trees, so I'm going to go in with a very, very wet wash and just cover the white paper. So I don't really want white showing through. It goes around the chimney, which is quite important because the chimney's orange. Now the roofs are grey, and I've got my big puddle of homemade grey. So I can put those on, stopping short because there is an orange ridge tile, which against the green looks lovely. So I can put that in. And there's also lichen on top of the roof, which is bright yellow, which is always a good thing to have. I'm just going to add slightly stronger paint in downwards motion to try and suggest slates. They're all very light, so I don't want to put too much in. And again, there's another slate roof that's a similar colour here, so I can just put in a weak wash for that just to claim space, and then a darker one on the next building, so just the same paint but slightly stronger. And then at the middle there's one that's an entirely different colour. It's obviously been replaced more recently, so I'm using Payne's grey. Just putting that in. By putting the roofs in first, I've defined the building. Sometimes it's easier to start the way they're built from the ground up, but this is complicated. So if I put the roofs in first, I've got the shapes, and that means I'm less likely to lose the angles. Now the building on the right is big stones, so I'm going to get some Naples yellow and put it next to the edge of my grey and mix the two just gently. If you make a big area of grey, you can keep amending it. I'm just going to put some on, and then I'm going to get some yellow ochre, again quite weak, and just drop that in next to the grey, not necessarily touching it. And they'll sort themselves out. And the rest of the building is cream. So in a clean area, I'm putting down some Naples yellow, and I'm just going to make some rectangles just to show the shape of the building. when you're drawing buildings, the idea is, even though this is an old one, that the uprights are vertical to the page and anything sideways will be at an angle. This is on a slope and it's very old, and not all the angles are true. I've got another roof to put in, but I didn't want it to bleed into each other, so I'll come back to that one. Now this is the start of an alleyway here, so it's getting different light where I'm doing now. So I'm going to add a tint to that. I'm going to add a little bit of orange or pink, probably pink. I was very vague about the windows. So I'm going to add some Alizarin crimson, just very, very weak in the middle. Then dry the brush off and move it. That shows that there's different lighting conditions on the side of the building without having to do any work. Now I can probably go back now and do this extra roof. Sometimes you just have to work on a different part of the painting while it's drying. Now the next stage is the sea wall, which is all little blocks. So I'm going to mix the grey and the yellow ochre together, because the wall is different colour, and I'm leaving a circle in the middle because there's a life belt there, so I want some of that to be white. And then I've got some sort of support and a little bit more wool, and then further up it's all stone. So I'm just leaving a ragged edge at the top, a wavy edge, because there's lots of grass. And if you don't want to do all the buildings, I have got done on the same day a more simple example of the front of the harbour. Now while I'm here, I'm going to put the harbour side in, and that's all different colours where it's been repaired over the years. So I'm just mixing up everything on the palette and putting it in. Go up to the suggestion of the road. Now the harbour itself is different colours, it's got different natural growth on it. So I'm just going to block it in to start with to get a good wall. Very lightly, and then I can add the other colours to it. Now I've got a sea wall here on the harbour side. That's much darker, so I'm just mixing in blues and greys into the lighter mix. I'm going to start with the top line, and then I'm going to change to vertical strokes. Keep reloading the brush. By doing vertical strokes, I can add another colour in to show that there is growth on the wall and the depth of it. So I'm going back into the Payne's grey. Just fill some of the gaps. Now I'm going to drop in some yellow ochre, quite weak, into the gaps. Just let it find its own way. And there's grass coming over this as well. So it hasn't got a perfect edge, but I'm just going to neaten it up a little bit. So while that's drying, I can go back to the sea, which has got a dark horizon. So I'm going to mix up French ultramarine and Viridian and a little bit of Cobalt turquoise. Just mix them all together to a strong colour, and then put in the horizon around the rocks. Now on this day it gets paler as it comes into the bay, so I'm just going to use water and pull out the existing paint. Just add a little bit as I go. Then dry the brush off and move the paint. And there's a few darker lines that are just coming away as the current goes around the rocks. So just put in a few lines like that and just leave them to find their own way. The next thing is the ridge tiles, which are orange. So I've got some chrome orange in my palette. I need it quite strong, but I need the brush quite dry. I'll start with the middle roof, and then they come forward there's one on the darker roof. They're not all bright orange, but I'm starting somewhere, and then I can always put a dirty brush on some of the others. So where they are quite dirty or darker, it might just be the lichen on them. I'm just dropping in some grey paint on top while it's still wet, just to soften them a little bit. Now the chimney's not quite the same colour, so I'm going to add a little bit of brown, a little bit of red. And dry the brush off and just move the paint. It's going to need 2 coats to get the chimney. And I've made a start. And there's a hint of a chimney coming up over the end, but only a hint. And then the chimney pots are a different orange again. They're more terracotta. So I'm going to add some burnt sienna to the mix. Now that the roof's dry, I can put on the trees that are above, which are several different greens. So I'm mixing up lemon yellow and French ultramarine and a little bit of yellow ochre just to give it a lift. And I'm starting in the middle of the roof and just doing an upward mark, and then another one, letting it skip over the paper. And coming forward again, stirring up the colour slightly differently. Go around the chimney. And up the cliff line. I'm just going to add a slightly different colour in and pull it back the other way. So I've got 2 or 3 different directions on the go. Now I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna just to warm up the green. In places by putting a dark area next to it. So you've got some branches and foliage mixed up. So now go back with the lemon yellow and a different green. Just mix it all in. Now I want to highlight some of it, so going back with the chrome yellow, and I'm just going to do half circles. Dab off the brush, just lose the edges slightly as though it's the top of the tree with new growth. Now, while I'm on the subject of greens, I'm coming down with a different green entirely, so I'm using French ultramarine to tint what I've already got, coming down to the area of the steps. And then dropping in some lemon yellow into that line, just top and bottom of it, just to give a more random edge for plants that are growing very happily on the edge of the road, down to the boat that's there. And then following the contour of the wall, a little bit of dark every now and again, which I'm using, say, the French ultramarine, just a tiny bit. Go back to the first green. And then there's some areas that are different plants or they're in their own shadow. So just going back with the French ultramarine mix again, just dropping in little areas. So I'm going to get some blue again and just add some variety, which will make it look more natural. Then very weak paint, and just drop it down to a lost edge against the wall. And then the water is very, very dark, the reflection. It's sort of like a bottle green, much darker than the wall. So I'll put in a dark line and then bring it forward with some lighter green. It's very deep, this basin, so that would be why there's a dark shadow and reflection. And then forward of that we've got sky colour. So going back to the blue turquoise mix, just dropping it in very lightly to the corner of the page. Now the next step is to try and make the sides of the buildings different, slightly different shades. So clean water, clean brush, and this front face is darker than the one round the corner, and this one's darker as well. So just put on some stronger paint, go around the pub signs, and then just take some of it back a bit so it looks more random. What you can do is use a tissue and just pick up a little bit, but picking it up with the brush is fine. And then this is a slight shadow forward from that. I can put that in, and then darker again on this wall. So I'll borrow some of that paint and take it across. On this one in the corner here, I've already added some Brazilian crimson to it, but I'm going to give another coat of paint. I will rub the pencil back shortly, but I'll just put it in there for now so that we can see what we're doing. And then the bottom seems to be slightly more protected than other areas, so it's not quite so dark. I'm just borrowing the paint, moving it across. But it's broken it up fairly well, and so you can, if you want to, just dab it with some kitchen roll. Kitchen roll works quite well because it doesn't fall apart when wet. So just get a little and just give it a dab, just every now and again. Now the roof here is slightly darker, so I'm going to use a little bit of some grey. Just put sideways strokes on just to make it a bit darker. And then as it's wet, I can drop some in to certain areas. And this bit's a bit darker as well. And then that area there's got lichen on it, so it's more orangey. So going in with the yellow ochre. And a little bit of Indian yellow, which is like orange. Just put that on where I can see that there's a lot of lichen. And then get a brush, just lose the edges of it. And then the area here is darker grey again. Just different age of roofs, I think. Now the steps, if you do just the downward steps and not the flat bits that you stand on, having drawn a rectangle, you can probably just get away with it, and then when it's dry, add a little bit of yellow just to brighten it up a bit. So the next move is the rocks again. They've had a chance to dry, so I'm going to mix up indigo and burnt sienna just to make a darker brown. And go side to side as the rocks weathered. And then drop some wet paint in there and find its own route. And then the bottom of the rock is a different colour again. Lighter brown. And the same here, sort of got its own line. Then it's much darker. And the ones near the pub are almost grey. just different weathering. So I now change to more of a grey colour. Put that in. Lots of rocks have got 2 or 3 different colours on if you have a look. And I want to separate some of that, so I'm just going to add some Naples yellow in here. Just drop it in, and that'll give light highlights. So the next move is the wall, which is all little blocks. So I'm going to use a mid-grey and some yellow ochre and just do blocks at random, leaving gaps. And then I'll drop the other colour in the gaps. I'll use a little bit of yellow ochre. Find its own way, just look random. And then the same yellow ochre, going to drop over the steps. A little bit stronger. And then bleed it off into the wall. And then go over it with a little bit of grey again. Just to give more of a lost and found edge to the steps. And there's a lot of grey here. I'm going around the area that I left for the life buoy, which I can't do till it's dry. And the same with this structure here. The door is open on the big boat shed here, so I'm just going to do a dark line to show that it's open. The bottom's a bit vague because there were so many parked cars I couldn't see where the bottom of anything was. But the building, the pub, hotel, does have black around the bottom. Which is quite helpful. So that anchors it nicely. Now the windows, the top window's easy. In the past, it's been boarded up. The next one's got 4 panes, and the bottom one has got 12 panes, so it's a bit of a freestyle event. So the top one's got a dark windowsill. And then so the next one's got 4 panes, but it's a grey window. So just diluting the grey with a little bit of blue. And as it's got 4 panes, I'm going to do the top right and the bottom left, and then go back. And that separates them slightly. And the one with 12, difficult to say what to do. So start in the middle. Then you can just see some windows inside the door, which is in a lobby. And then there's another window with 12, so I'll start in the middle again. And then there's a bay window. So I'll avoid that for the moment and do the one above it, which has got 4. And then there's another one with 4. And I think the others are all the same. There's a line underneath where it's open. Now the bay window, it's not a bay window, it's just that the top ones are open. It's got about 26 windows. So the answer is to do the middle ones. And hope nobody's counting. And then there's a dark line on the edge of the building. And a dark line to the doorway. So that's a reasonable start, and there's a shadow above here. And we can just make this a little bit more well defined. There is a white wall inside, but from a painting point of view, it's easier to make it dark. Now the harbour has got lots of lichen on it, so I'm going to use some Gamboge, or you can use any bright colour you've got, yellowy orange. Just makes a change. And then the rest of it is very dark, so I'm using a dark brown mix, because that will help the lichen show up and the paths around it show up. And I'm just mixing some Naples yellow with the grey I had earlier, because the top of the harbour is a different colour entirely. Well, perhaps because it doesn't get so wet so constantly. And then there's a join, it changes direction. And then back to mid-grey again for the outer harbour wall, which is also a walkway. And leave a little gap and then put the top of that in. You have to suggest these things. I just need to go back to the rocks and put a bit more emphasis on them. So I've got the small brush and I'm doing up and down strokes. It is low tide and there's lots and lots of crevices on the rocks. You just have to suggest the nooks and crannies. You can't do them all, but at the bottom of this rock, they're sideways. It's just the way it's eroded. There's a complete change of direction. And a dark line, bit of a silhouette, which I'll just bleed out. And then it's also got a little bit of a silhouette, just the way it's against the light from the other side. In fact, they all have, because they're just looking into the light. Now, you can keep going forever with the pub, but there are some signs that could go on. There's a black sign that's got some writing on, which if you wanted to put the writing on, you could do it with gouache afterwards. And then there's a nice sign that's black on the outside and it's got a picture in the middle, so that's blue, so I can do that in a minute. And I think the top window could do with being a fraction darker. And the life buoy's got to go on, so I'm just using a bright red and doing 2 sides of a circle. And then when it's dry, I can do some grey in the middle. Now, having put all the rock in, the grass on the top of the rock is looking a bit pale. So I'll just go over that again. And I've got a boat that's upside down and it's on a trailer. And again, that's red round the gunnel. And some of it's in shadow, so I'm going to make the shadow blue. And I need to do a bit of shadow underneath it. Just change brushes and then just move the paint out slightly. Now there's lots of rails and walkways here, but you needn't put them all in if you're doing a picture. You just put in what suits you. You can keep going forever, but there is a change in levels, which I can indicate with a change in colour. And I can, now it's dry, go back to the chimney and do a little bit more work, which I couldn't do when it was wet. So that's now got to dry, and then I can just highlight anything that's left. There's no water showing in the harbour because the tide's out. It's in the inner harbour, but not the outer harbour. So I need a grey to go in there that's quite warm, just to show that there is something there. And then the trees on the hill and the background are hardly showing at all, but they're quite dark, so I'm going to use a bluey grey. Just go down from the skyline, just put a little bit on and leave the bottom. And I'm going to put some grey in the doorway. Now the life belt's had a moment to dry, so I can go inside it with just a dark dot, and the wall plaque, you can't see, I think it's a sailing boat, you can't see exactly what it is, but we'll just put something in there. And there's a couple more black signs. And a black lamp, 2 black lamps. One of them is an old AA one, motoring organisation, and that's yellow. Just put a tiny bit more blue on the top of the sky. It's really taking the paintbrush for a walk. But it just, now I've got all the other colours in, just gives it a bit of life. And there's a tiny bit of beach showing. I can put some different colour there. We've got the same village, Charlestown, different view with the hotel, which is a more complicated thing to draw. But whichever view you decide, I'm sure that you'll have a lovely walk and feel better for it. Thank you very much for watching.